All right, Puri, take it away.
Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do first is to just give a quick recap of the presentation that Rolf gave 2 weeks ago before I do the actual, line by line reading of the changes that we have done. So again, I'm not going to go over each of these slides, so I will just provide a summary of what Rolf presented 2 weeks back. Okay. So the first uh, the part of the presentation here is really to provide, since we have been working on this for so long, just to remind everybody that, hey, what is that we are trying to do here and why is that we need to do this now? Okay. So the motivation for what we are trying to achieve in this particular ticket. Okay. So this is the quick overview of what was already presented. So I'm going to go over some of this quickly. So the first part is what is missing. So this whole thing started when we introduced persistent collectives, and the definition of persistent wasn't present in the semantic terms section of the chapter 2. Uh, there was, of course, a persistent point-to-point operation, and then there was a reference to persistent request there in that particular section. Now that we have persistent operation across multiple chapters, it was suggested that we add all these common definitions into the semantic terms section. Okay. And then when we started looking into that, then this whole notion of the word operation, which was defined more than 1,000 times, but was never actually defined what it is. So that's something that we ended up fixing, but I think there's more on that on the next slide. Okay. So the first part I already explained that, the word persistent was originally persistent point to point, but once we added the collectives, we had to define that. And since there was no definition, the, the ticket started as adding uh, this particular definition into the semantic terms. But once we started working on this, then we noticed that okay, that there is really no persistent. Everything else in the semantic term section was defined as persistent procedures, and we all kind of understood that the persistent fits with this sequence of blocking, non-blocking, and persistent. Whereas blocking and non-blocking make sense as procedures, it didn't make any sense to have a persistent procedure because it's a persistent operation. And then, of course, there was no MPI operation that was defined, so we thought, okay, let's add that and then add the persistent operation. So that's where all of this started. Okay. Okay, so just a quick recap of what the current definitions look in the semantic terms section. So this is what the current definitions look like in the semantics terms section. There are basically 5 of these terms defined: non-blocking, blocking, local, non-local, and collective. And our goal was to add persistent there. When we started looking into that, that's when the scope kind of expanded. Okay. All right. So this is just to make sure that, these are the terms that are in the standard as of today. All right. So then we went, again, Rolf went through each one of this. We kind of went through each of these definitions in addition to adding the term persistent. Once we started adding that, then we noticed that, okay, um, there are all these other definitions are which needs to be clarified slightly, even though they have been there for a long time. There were a couple of things which need to be, either in some cases they were completely broken, or some cases needs to be clarified or rephrased better, or whatever the case may be. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go through each one of this because Ralph spent the whole time last 2 weeks back on this. So again, we went through each one of these: non-blocking, uh, why it's broken or needs to be updated, blocking, what's the best way to do that, So again, we will show the definitions that we have today later on, but this is just to recap how we ended up looking at these things. Again, same thing with the notion of collective, and there is this particular sentence about may or may not be synchronizing. What does that mean? Again, this was written before the non-blocking collectives were added. Now we have non-blocking and persistent collectives. So how does that affect that? Okay. So again, that needs to be clarified in terms of the collective operation, and same thing with local. So there was a lot of discussion on whether this was a weak local or strong local. Of course, local was this term was related to progress and how to make sure that we don't change the original meaning. Okay, and uh, again, we went through this particular example and why the local has to be a weak local and not a strong local according to this definition. Okay, so obviously that needs to be updated as well, and same thing with non-local. So again, I'm not going to go through all the discussion that Rolf went through here, but just to show that this is kind of the procedure that we went through. Okay, so the basic idea is, okay, we would add what is an operation, then we would define what is a persistent operation, and then we would fix all the other remaining terms to make it clear, or in cases where it's broken, fix it. Okay, that was the basic premise of what we did as part of this ticket, and obviously it has taken a long time because this does affect uh, directly or indirectly other parts of the standard. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't try to break something else while trying to fix these. Okay, and this kind of summarizes what we have done with this ticket 96 or issue 96 and the corresponding pull request. So we have added the term MPI operation or operations, and then defined it as having these 4 stages, and then 3 forms of these operations, and then collective and non-collective operations. And then the current definitions, we have moved it under MPI procedure, and again structured it such a way that it flows with the rest of the description. Okay, so this is in essence what we have, and of course we have added a table at the end to kind of show what these procedures and the corresponding operations and the properties of the procedures are related with. Okay, so in the semantic term section, we have added 2 subsections, one for operations, one for procedures, and one for MPI data types. The text under that already existed. We didn't change that. We just added a subheading called MPI data types. Okay, so this is kind of the big picture, what this particular ticket tries to achieve. And again, a couple of points on this side. We didn't want to change the definition of any MPI procedure as is, and we wanted to make it as consistent with the rest of the standard as possible. We didn't want to break anything while we are trying to fix this. Okay. And now, of course, I will go through the actual reading of the changes that we have done to really show the exact changes that we have done in order to show what we have done here. Okay. Before I get to that, any questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, let me switch to the PDF file. Let's see, I guess I had to stop the sharing and share the PDF again. Okay. So here is the actual text from the section 2.4. Okay. So I'm going to read all the changes that we have done and stop at each paragraph and see if there are any questions and continue if there are no questions. Okay. So this, we we in fact added this particular word here. The words function, routine, procedure, procedure call, and call are often used as synonyms within the standard because that's the way it's been used. Okay, so that one sentence was added, and then the first paragraph in the semantics terms section. When discussing MPI procedures, the following semantic terms are used. The term message data buffer refers to the send or receive buffer used in a communication procedure. The terms target data buffer, origin data buffer, and result data buffer refers to the data buffers used by RMA communication procedures. The term file data buffer refers to the data buffers used by MPIO procedures. In this section, we use the term data buffer, and depending on the MPI procedure, it will refer to message data buffer, target data buffer, origin data buffer, result data buffer, or file data buffer. So instead of saying multiples of these terms, we just say data buffer, and depending on the appropriate procedure, it will correspond to one of this. So that's the basic intent of defining that there. Okay. And then the first section here is on MPI operations. MPI operation. An MPI operation is a sequence of steps performed by the MPI library to establish and enable data transfer and or synchronization. It consists of 4 stages: initialization, starting, completion, and freeing, and it is implemented as a set of one or more procedures. See section 2.4.2. Okay. So Jim had a suggestion that we add a couple of sentences to say that we could use more than one procedure to do that. That's actually there in the procedure section. So that's why we haven't added it here. Since we're talking about operation, we didn't add it here, but in the procedure section, we do have those sentences. Okay. So I will come back to that discussion with Jim later on if necessary. Okay, now we describe each of these operations or each of these stages. Okay, initialization hands over the argument list to the operation, but not the contents of the data buffer, if any. The specification of an operation may state that array arguments must not be changed until the operation is freed. Starting hands over the control of the data buffers, if any, to the associated operation. Note that initiation refers to the combination of the initialization and starting stages. And then the third stage is completion. Completion returns control of the contents of the data buffers to the application and indicates that output buffers and arguments, if any, have been updated. Note that an MPI operation is complete when the MPI procedure implementing the completion stage returns. Freeing returns control of the rest of the argument list, example, the data buffer, addresses, and array arguments. MPI operations are available in one or more of these forms: blocking, non-blocking, and persistent. Okay, so that's the overview of the definition of MPI operation and the various stages a typical MPI operation may consist of. Then we define the 3 forms of MPI operations: blocking, non-blocking, and persistent. Okay. Blocking operation. For a blocking operation, all 4 stages are combined in a single procedure call, as shown in figure 2.1 and defined in section 2.4.2. So you have the basic state transition from start to end. Everything happens. So there is really no state, basically. You have the start and the end state there. Non-blocking operations. For a non-blocking operation, the initialization and starting stages are combined into a single non-blocking procedure call, and the completion and freeing stages are combined into a separate single procedure call, which can be blocking or non-blocking, as shown in figure 2.2 and defined in section 2.4.2. So essentially, we have a state, the start state, then it goes to the active state, and then once the state is completed, it does the completion. So here, essentially, the initialization and starting are combined, and completion and freeing are combined into a single procedure. Okay. And the last one is the persistent operation. For a persistent operation, there is a separate procedure for each of the four stages as shown in figure 2.3 and defined in section 2.4.2. Each of these procedures may be blocking or not blocking. So basically now we have four different procedures for each stage and associated states with that. Okay. And the state diagram illustrates that point. Additionally, an MPI operation can be collective or non-collective. So first we talked about the three operations in the form blocking, non-blocking, and persistent, and then we have either an operation which can be collective or non-collective. Now we define those two. So this cuts across the page. So I'll show it like this. Collective operations are defined as operations that involve a group or group of MPI processes. For collective operations, the completion stage may or may not finish before all processes in the group has started the operation. So, this is pretty much what was there early on. We have just taken one part off, which is the synchronization part. We will cover that later with the procedures. Okay, so here we are talking about the operation. Collective operations are also available as blocking, non-blocking, and persistent operation. Then the non-collective operations are defined as operations that are not collective. So operations which are not collective or non-collective operations. Okay, so this is the subsection on MPI operations. Okay, so any questions on the operations section before I move on to the procedures, MPI procedures? Now, continuing along the MPI procedures, all MPI procedures can either be local or non-local, defined as follows. Non-local procedure. An MPI procedure is non-local if returning may require the execution of some specific semantically related MPI procedure on another MPI process. So this is slightly different than, at least it reads slightly different than what it was originally stated. But if you really look at the text changes, it just adds some specific semantically related. Okay. So in the earlier definition, if you recall, it said MPI procedure. So here we have saying some specific semantically related MPI procedure. Okay, so that's for the non-local procedure. And for the local procedure, we basically say that an MPI procedure is local if it is not local. So it's basically the converse of the non-local procedure. Okay. An MPI operation is implemented as a set of one or more MPI procedures. An MPI operation-related procedure implements at least a part of the stage of an MPI operation as described in section 2.4.1. An MPI operation-related procedure may also implement one or more stages of one or several MPI operations. In certain cases, more than one MPI operation-related procedure may be needed to implement a single stage. Okay. There are also other MPI procedures that do not implement any stage of an MPI operation. So to Jim's comment, here we essentially have what you had suggested that we had. Okay. And continuing along the same theme, the semantics of the MPI operation-related procedures are described using two orthogonal independent concepts. Completeness depends on which stage are included and locality. Some procedures are either incomplete or completing or freeing, or completing and freeing based on the status of the associated operation at the time the procedure returns. Also, all such procedures can be described as either blocking or non-blocking, but these latter two terms refer to combination of the completeness and locality concepts. Additionally, all MPI operation-related procedures can be collective or non-collective. The following are properties of MPI operation related procedures. So here we are talking about MPI operation related procedures. So basically we said there will be a procedure for each of those stages. Of course, it makes only sense for MPI operation related procedures. So now we have the various procedures corresponding to each of the stages of the MPI operation. Initialization procedure. An MPI procedure is an initialization procedure if return from the procedure indicates that the associated operation has completed its initialization stage, which implies that the user has handed over control of the argument list, but not contents of the data buffers to MPI. The user is still allowed to read or modify the contents of the data buffers. If an initialization procedure is not also the freeing procedure of the associated operation, defined below, then the user is not permitted to deallocate the data buffers or to modify the array arguments. Starting procedure. An MPI procedure is the starting procedure if return from the procedure indicates that the associated operation has completed its starting stage, which implies that the user has handed over control of the data buffers to MPI. If the starting procedure is not also a completing procedure of the associated operation, defined below, then the user is not permitted to modify input data buffers or to read output data buffers. Initiation procedure. An initiation procedure, an MPI procedure is an initiation procedure if return from the procedure indicates that both the initialization and the starting stages have completed, which implies control of the entire argument list is handed over to MPI. So based on how we defined initiation as combination of initialization and starting, so of course there could be a procedure which does both of them. Completing procedure. An MPI procedure is called completing if return from the procedure indicates that at least one associated operation has finished its completion stage, which implies that the user can rely on the contents of the output data buffers and modify the content of input and output data buffers of such operations. If a completing procedure is not also a freeing procedure defined below, then the user is not permitted to deallocate the data buffers or to modify the array arguments. Incomplete procedure. An MPI procedure is called incomplete if it is not a completing procedure. Okay. So the converse of completing procedure is incomplete procedure. Freeing procedure. An MPI procedure is freeing if return from the procedure indicates that at least one associated operation has finished its freeing stage, which implies that the user can reuse all parameters specified when initializing such associated operations. Okay. So essentially going over the stages there. And now for the other types of operation, blocking and non-blocking. Non-blocking procedure, a non-MPI procedure is non-blocking if it is incomplete and local. So now we are defining a non-blocking procedure in terms of the completeness and the locality. So we are saying that non-blocking procedure is, an MPI procedure is non-blocking if it is incomplete and local. And then the blocking procedure, an MPI procedure is blocking if it is not non-blocking. And then again, these are all for operation related procedures only. And then we have an advice for users. Note that for operation related MPI procedure, in most cases, incomplete procedures are local and completing procedures are non-local. Exceptions are noted where such procedures are defined. In many cases, an additional prefix letter I as an abbreviation for the word incomplete and immediate marks non-blocking procedures in the procedure name. And here we list some of those categories. Some categorization examples are listed below. Non-blocking procedures. So we have non-blocking procedures. Of course, they have to be incomplete and local. We have just given a short list here. And then for blocking procedures, depending on the other three cases possible, completing and non-local. So these are some of the examples for that. Incomplete and non-local, again some examples for that. Completing and local, we have one example for that. And then, of course, MPI procedures that are not operation related. We have just given a couple of examples, but there could be obviously many more in that particular category. Okay, so again, this is just a advice to users, just to kind of give an idea what how these procedures are categorized. Okay. And then the last part is the collective procedure. A collective procedure, an MPI procedure is collective if all processes in a group or groups of MPI processes need to invoke the procedure. Initialization procedures of collective operations over the same process group must be executed in the same order by all members of the process group. Okay. So now notice that we have both non-blocking and persistent. So that addresses that. An MPI collective procedure is synchronizing if it will only return once all processes in the associated group or groups of MPI processes have called the appropriate matching MPI procedure. So this is to talk about the synchronizing collective procedures. The initiation procedures for non-blocking collective operation and the starting procedures for persistent collective operations are local and shall be synchronizing. All other procedures for collective operations, such as for blocking collective operation and initialization procedures for persistent collective operations, may or may not be synchronizing. Okay. So again, an advice to users, calling any synchronizing function is erroneous when there is no possibility of corresponding calls at all other processes in the associated process group. Waiting for completion of any collective operation is erroneous when there is no possibility that all other processes in the associated group will be able to start the corresponding operation. Advice to users and advice to users. And Annex A.2 summarizes semantics of all operation-related MPI procedures. So we have a table where we go by the various types of procedures and list what operations they perform. Okay. So that's all. And then we have added this particular subsection and says for data types, the following terms are defined. So the rest, it's unchanged as far this particular section is concerned. Okay. And then, wherever we have exceptions, we have noted those exceptions in those particular chapters like mprobe, mreceive, and things like that. So I can go into that, but before I get into that, I wanted to wait here and see if there was any questions or comments.
I have a question on the term completing. If you can go to figure, I think it was 2.2. 2.2 and 2.3, that's the first time that completing occurs. And once it's completion and freeing, aka completing, and once it's just completion, aka completing. And it's not really defined anywhere. So maybe figure 2.2 is just
okay.
A little confusing.
It is defined above. It is defined above. If you scroll up, it is defined. Completing is defined.
It isn't. No, I'd search for it. It's not completing. The term completing is not.
It says complete, not completing. I think that's close enough.
Well, but it's confusing in the figures, right? So once it's also known as completion and freeing, and once it's also known as completion. So which one is it?
Okay, so in the you're talking about the in the diagram, the whatever the thing in the bracket, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So here we say complete, but you're saying here we are calling it completing.
So if I search for it, I won't find the definition of completing anywhere.
So I think this is a remnant of what was in the earlier diagram. So we just probably need to get rid of the AKA, because initiation we have, but completing we don't, and here also we don't. I think this just needs to go. If I
Puri, can you just put up the definition of persistent of the procedure version of this completing procedure? Yeah, there we are. So it's
okay.
procedure is called completing if returned from.
Okay, it is there. All right.
But that is after those figures, right?
We can include a forward reference if you like.
Okay.
So would that address your concern, or should we just remove it here because it's explained there? Obviously, this is the diagram is coming before the procedures are
Cleaner
defined.
if you just remove the AKA stuff all over and just leave it as the explicit notation.
Yeah.
I think that way,
Yeah, I guess what it's adding is that the stuff outside of the brackets is the stages that are part of that transition, that state transition, and the thing in the brackets, the AKA, is the name of the procedure that does that. And so both are true at this stage.
The caption talks about operations, though, not about procedures. So removing the AKA would keep it clean.
Yes, but it then breaks the it removes the link then from the pictures. We could redo the pictures in the next subsection, and put the thing that's in brackets on these lines instead. But it's exactly the same diagram, except we've just put or we could move the diagrams later. Also, I like the diagrams here actually, but so I don't really mind. I think any of these are viable to me. A forward reference, the AKAs are the name for that we give to the term that we use to refer to the procedure that does this combination of stages. Fine. Remove it. Fine. Leave it as it is. Fine. All those are to me.
So if we remove the AKA, would that be something that, obviously we say that in the text in the procedure section, so we are not going to lose this, but
So I think
the removing
Sorry,
would change one other thing, because the AKA is actually not correct looking at this, right? Because you have completing and freeing, also known as completing, and then later on you have completion, also known as completing, right? So AKA is kind of an implicit definition, and you're kind of defining it twice with a different meaning. That was intended, I know that, but that's kind of how it can come across.
Yeah. I think removing it probably makes the most sense. So that way it just looks, this is just about operations, and this, sticks to that and doesn't talk about the procedure here.
I think that point is fair. It isn't trying to redefine something, but it is actually true in both cases, right? The completion and freeing stage, the procedure that does both those stages combined is a completing procedure in the non-blocking case, and it is only the procedure that does the completion stage in the persistent case that is completing. The freeing one is not completing, right? Because it doesn't do the completing.
It's already complete.
Yeah.
Okay. I think probably just getting the AKA off looks like the
Yeah, we should probably just remove it.
Yeah. Good catch, Joseph. Okay. Any other comments, suggestion?
So I guess the other reverse question is if this would come up for reading in the vote, anybody objecting to these new definitions? Anybody's okay with the way it's phrased right now? Is approval quietness, or is this I don't know yet quietness, or I'm doing my email quietness?
Do you need a thumbs up? Are you calling for a straw vote? What are you asking for?
Yeah, I guess a straw vote would probably be helpful, right, Puri?
Yeah, because initially, I mean, obviously we did a reading and we made change. I mean, we did several reading and we have been making changes, and we believe that this is the the version which is as good to being final as that we can come up with. So this is the version that we are going to based on the suggestions that we get within the next 10 days, we'll send it for reading. So if there are any concerns, this is the time we would like to hear from people. And if they want us to add another sentence, clarify something, for example, that diagram looks like that was a good one. We kind of when we were initially doing it, we were doing it with both procedures and operations together. So we were trying to put all that in one diagram. But now, since it's just about operations, I think it's clear. Of course, we could replicate the diagram with the procedures, but I think for now it's okay. So anything else where people say that, no, this is, this is changing the definition, or this is not clear, or needs to be clarified, anything like that would be, this is the time to do it.
Would definitely prevent more discussions and no votes in the June meeting.
Correct.
I think I was one of the people who was opposed to it earlier, but this version looks much better, and I am quite comfortable with this.
Okay.
Even prefer it for that matter.
Thank you.
Perhaps that's a good way to phrase it. I mean, the straw votes are kind of difficult to do over this medium. But anybody, there were a couple people among the ones that were on the call today that had concerns before. Anybody on that group thinks this text solved these issues? Or does anybody still see any issues left that needs to be addressed before this should come up for a reading and a vote?
I had some objections previously. I don't see any, I don't have reason for them anymore with this new text.
Thanks, that's good to know.
Thank you, Ryan.
All right, I think since I don't hear anything else, Puri, that's probably a good. If you're not comfortable speaking up, you also feel free to send Puri email afterwards directly.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Sorry, just a little bit orthogonal, but Martin, if you want to do straw votes, other calls have been doing such votes with like a hands like a hand up thing. I don't know if WebEx has it, but there are tools.
WebEx has that, unfortunately, and now Zoom has these things and stuff, but WebEx does not. That's one of the problems.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, that's okay. That's fine. It would be nice if they had like an instant poll, right? I mean, a lot of other systems have that, but I think we're stuck with this here.
You could get everybody to type in the chat window. That gets stored.
Yeah, the low-tech approach.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm just hoping that if somebody has a reason to say no and abstain, they would speak up now, and otherwise we'll hopefully we can move on to the smaller changes in the rest of the ticket.
Yeah, and I personally request everybody to take a look at this. This is with the PR right now, and the PDF file and all the changes are already in there. So if you could take a look at it and either comment there or send me a comment, I'm happy to discuss this with the working group. And our goal is to really have a final version by the June 15th date. So that way we can do a full formal reading and go without having to do any more no votes, and continue with the second reading and get it into the 4.0 standard.
So also, if you then after this meeting look over the slides or look over the text again and you have something, please send it to Puri so he can collect this and we can make sure this gets updated before the 15th deadline. Okay. Puri, do you want to continue on to the very small changes?
I could, but would that make sense, or you know, are there other things that you want to continue on?
It depends how formal this informal reading is.
Right. So this is, you know, this is not a formal reading, right?
We'll do that again for sure because it's so much fun. But it's more the thing. Do you think is there anything else that people need to basically where there could be questions still and you need to sign off on that?
I could, you know, go over the changes. I just need to change to the another PDF file which has the annotation, since it's easy to search there.
I mean, let's ask the group: is there any, does it make sense to go with the smaller changes? Do people want to do this separately? Is there any particular wishes from the rest of the group or what they want to see to make them even more comfortable with this ticket and the rest of the changes to the standard? Because there are a lot of smaller changes too. And then there's the table and the annex, right?
Yes.
And you could also say a word of what we decided on the RMA chapter to make sure people are aware of this too when it comes up.
Yes. So I was going to talk about that. So we actually started looking at, you know, we wanted to make sure that we didn't break the definition of anything across the entire standard. So we started looking at that, you know, at the February meeting, we had not looked at the RMA chapter. Later on, Martin brought the some of the definitions within the RMA chapter and said, hey, you know, how does that work? And, you know, we started, you know, Rolf went ahead and made those changes based on that. But then we said, we need to take a closer look at the RMA chapter, because the RMA chapter uses phrases like is not blocking, does not block. I believe the intent was to say that, you know, it is local, but, you know, it is actually written as, you know, not blocking or does not block or one of those variations. So we did not want to go and change the 50 different occurrences of blocking or does not block or is not blocking without having a thorough review. So the working group's decision was to not touch the RMA chapter right now and to have a thorough review of the RMA chapter later on, and to then update the correct use of local versus blocking versus non-blocking, depending on the context in which it's used. So for now, our you know, what I don't have here in the PDF is we would like to put some kind of a disclaimer, advice to users, advice to implementers. You know, we haven't figured out exactly the text that goes in there, but something to the extent to say that, you know, that the definitions that we have defined in the semantic terms chapter haven't been consistently applied to the RMA chapter. Whereas we have done that for the rest of the standard.
I'm not sure that's a good solution, saying that, hey, this chapter doesn't use the new definitions. Now I have to go back to the API 3.1 to figure out the definitions. That doesn't sound right.
The argument was that we know it's not the optimal choice, but the alternative is to spend all the time that's necessary to go through doing it. And so my argument was people have been able to implement and use the one-sided with the definitions that they have. And so it doesn't harm anything to defer, and it's only deferring doing the update. I agree it's not perfect, but I think it's a pragmatic compromise.
I guess the question is, what's the reason for the compromise? Is it because people don't have time to spend to update the chapter, or what's the reason for that compromise?
Yeah, how tricky the RMA is, and so it would be pretty easy to just go through and make changes by swapping out the terms. What we didn't want to do is go through and do that and introduce new errors. And so by deferring the changes, we know that we're not making anything worse. If we were to rush the changes, I don't think I could say that.
It would be that the working group would continue and do this fix, and we were planning on doing a cleanup for 1 relatively quickly after 4.0 anyway, and then we would target this for that time frame.
Yeah, exactly. We definitely need to have this done for 4.1.
I feel like it should be all or nothing, the semantics change. If it is, if you're doing it, the voting should be done with all of the changes consistently done throughout the standard. I wouldn't want to have not half, but 90% done and something missing. If that means delaying this to 4.1, then you could do that.
So the problem is that we need this for, well, if this was merely a cleanup update of terms that are already being used for routines that were already introduced, then I would agree with that. The genesis of this was that for the new persistent operations, we didn't have good definitions for the terms, and so this is the place we're caught between the rock and the hard place, is that we need to introduce more precise terms for the persistent operations that have been added. So if the only way I would be comfortable leaving these updates of terms out is if we took all the new persistent routines and left them out as well. And that's the problem. So don't view this as a cleanup of the terms to be cleaning up the terms. It was, we need to define the terms for the persistent operations, and we uncovered more things that need to be changed. And what we're suggesting here is that in places where implementations and users have been able to build correct implementations and write correct programs, we can defer improving the quality of the language for 4.1 while still providing enough precision to define the new terms. And again, it's not perfect. I think it's pragmatic, but that was the reasoning behind this.
Thing to add, I mean, as Puri said, Rolf started going through and making the changes. And I think as a working group, at least, we think we came to the conclusion that these changes can be applied and it is possible to do fairly easily, and we didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
But doing this in the next 10 days, which we would have to do to meet the 2-week deadline to make a reading and to not delay 4.0, which users have been asking us for, would be dangerous. It's more this 10-day window that worries us than anything else.
Right. And just to continue on what Martin said, so we went through the thought exercise to see, hey, the definitions that we have added, does it break anything in the RMA chapter? And our exercise indicated, no, it does not break anything. It's just that we uncovered that, the language is not consistent. For example, here is one example. WinPost does not block. Right? So probably the intent is to say that it's a local operation. And there are many such cases where, non-blocking is used, where, so the definition, it still holds. It's just that the wording used in the RMA chapter is slightly different than the rest of the standard.
Yeah, Puri, you might want to show the example, the text for the example as well that said.
I was trying to go to that section. I forgot which section was it.
It's a little bit later on, isn't it? It says something like the post calls are non-blocking and should complete. And we think that sentence is probably also saying the post calls are local. But they're using non-blocking rather than earlier it was saying does not block. So it probably means does not block here when it says non-blocking, and should complete probably is a tautology with that. So this sentence is probably the post calls are local in parlance. But I wouldn't want to, doing that change, it seems right. It seems to match, and nobody complained in the call when we were doing this exercise, but it feels like that to do that without proper thought and without seeing how that impacts everywhere else. It seems very risky to make that sort of change in the RMA chapter in such short order. It's not that it won't get done, and I think everybody agrees that the ideal is to do this as one big change across the whole document, make it all consistent. But I think that the timing, just the elapsed time, it's not even that people don't have time to give to this, we would give it, but the elapsed time to think about the impact and the small changes, they seem small, but they may have a big impact. I think that's the concern is, and there's no reason to do this particular bit, as Bill was saying, we can defer. This is deferrable because people have read this for a long time and not come up with this is a problem, I don't understand this, what does it mean here, right? So I think that's the sort of process we've gone through it anyway in terms of thinking it. Yeah, ideally we would have done all of this for the 4.0 time frame, but it just isn't going to happen unless we delay 4.0, and that's bad for a number of other reasons.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. Just to be clear, I think it was meant to be non-blocking, not local. It could communicate.
That's exactly the kind of discussion we were held up, and that's why we wanted to have a thorough review of the whole working group.
It's with respect to this example. So I think what it is, again, this section is on progress. So basically, it's saying that, hey, these calls should continue without being deadlocked, right? And that's what it is saying here. And it says the post calls are non-blocking and should complete.
I think we can discuss that separate. I get the intent of why you are.
So there you go. Thank you very much. So that was that. I mean, we went and made this change and we reverted back because, we said, oh, wait a minute, there may be more of this. And by doing this, are we actually changing the original intent? And, that's the reason we reverted back the changes that we had already done. All right. Okay, so that's about the RMA chapter. Everything else we have gone over, and then the table in the footnotes here for the annex. Okay. So that's the other change that we have done. Again, we have gone over this in the previous meeting as well, and Rolf pointed that there's one update I need to do, which I will do. But otherwise, I can show you an example of a change that we have done where we have noted the exceptions. So this is not the annotated version, so it's not easy to get to that change. Let me look at the annotated PDF and get back to this in a second. IAM probe. Okay, so we noted that, wherever we had exceptions, we would mention that in the appropriate section. So this is an example of one such exception. The annotated PDF has all of them marked. The version I'm showing right now is not the annotated PDF. So here is an example of how we have noted exceptions to the general rule. So in this particular case, we say that IAM probe is a local procedure according to the definitions of section 2.4.2. And in contrast to MPI probe, it is a non-blocking procedure because it is the initialization of a matched receive operation. So there are about 6 or 7 such exceptions, and we have explicitly noted such exceptions. Okay. I can go over all of those if
that's Artem. I have a short question. Sure. You say here it's a non-blocking procedure because it's the initialization. Isn't it initiation in your terminology when you initialize and start? Because I guess iProbe, you pass the ownership of the buffers.
No, this is IAM probe, not iProbe. So we are saying in contrast to iProbe. Okay, this is IAM probe. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
The initialization is refers to the IAM probe, right? Not the iProbe.
IAM probe, yes.
Right. So it is. So I agree. Shouldn't it be initiating rather than initializing? Because it is the initiation of the matching receive operation rather than the initialization. Because the message handle is being posted, right?
There's no data buffer given to IAM probe. That's given to the M receive.
Yeah.
So there's no. You can't hand over the data buffer if it's not even an argument.
No, not the data buffer, but the message handle is what I was talking about. I guess message handle is not covered in the starting. Starting is only for the buffer, right?
Yeah, the message handle is doing the same job as the request in a normal situation. In an initialization procedure for a persistent, there is a request, and it's effectively the same role. It's not a request, obviously, but it's doing the same job as. It's not a data buffer. It's something else. It's one of the other parameters.
Yeah. So obviously, that's this is something that Rolf has gone through each one of these functions, and wherever we thought that okay, it needs to be explicitly stated, we have stated that. And I will also make the annotated version available so that way people can just search number 96 and it will take you to all the changes in 96 if they're interested in looking at the PDF file. Of course, on Git you can easily see this as well. Thanks, Bill. All right, so Martin, you want me to look at show all the other ones, or how do we do next?
I mean, more question for the group, what they want to see. I think we have the time, so it probably can't hurt to make sure nobody objects to any particular things, unless people want to see something else specific, or if there's any other business. I mean, I don't see a harm in doing that.
I'm going to stop sharing this when I switch to the other PDF file. If there are other questions, please feel free to bring them up while I pull up the correct PDF file. Sorry, I didn't have the right annotated PDF handy. All right, I got it. Oh, I need to share this. All right. Okay. So I want to make sure that everybody can see the file that I'm sharing, since I have multiple windows open here. Okay. So the number 96 BSEN. Okay. All right. So again, a similar note. According to the definition of section 2.4.2, MPI BSEN is a completing procedure, and the user can reuse all resources given as arguments, including the message data buffer. It is also a local procedure because it returns immediately without depending on the execution of any MPI procedure in any other MPI process. There is some glitch here. Advice to users. Yeah, I'm not sure about the glitch. Then advice to user, this is one of the exceptions in which the completing and therefore blocking operation related procedure is local. So this is just an example of the changes that we have done when we have specifically found procedures which don't comply to the general rule. And I'm not sure about this glitch, but it could be in the annotated version, but I didn't see that in the original version. So That's one example. Next one for rsend. Again, we have added, oh, it's right after here, bsend, okay. Although the completion of rsend does not depend on any specific procedure call in the corresponding receiving MPI process, the MPI rsend is not defined to be a local operation because its completion may still depend on progress on the corresponding receiving MPI process, example provided by a call to MPI test, MPI wait, blocking MPI operation related procedures, or MPI finalize. Okay. Oh, I think that was just a refreshing list because it's not there anymore.
Even better.
Okay, so I'm not sure. Maybe it's just my rendering that made it. Okay. Right. Continuing on. Okay. And we added the word incomplete in addition to immediate here. In addition to the prefix I for immediate and incomplete indicates that the call is non-blocking. Note that the prefix I in MPI iProbe stands only for immediate since it does not initiate communication. Okay, of course, we have had this discussion, about the iProbe. So this is again just to clarify that the I in iProbe stands for immediate, not incomplete. Okay. And then we
point of the previous. Sorry, can you go back to the previous change? So I thought the previous text was already correct.
The incomplete was not there. It just said immediate.
Correct, which is correct.
Right.
Originally it said I stands for immediate, and that's it. It didn't say anything about iProbe.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct, right?
Yeah. So now that we have added that, I could be immediate and incomplete because iProbe is an example.
If you add another call later, again, we have to go and modify this text to keep this updated. If you didn't have this change at all, the text was correct already.
But then iProbe was an exception, right?
No, because it would just say in addition, the iProbe thing was not there at all, right?
That's correct. Yes, we added iProbe.
In addition, right, so it just said in prefix to ICE means it's immediate. I stands for immediate rather.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so what's the problem with that? What are you trying to fix?
So now we are saying that whenever there is anything with an I, it doesn't mean that it's immediate. It could be incomplete too, because that's how the non-blocking is defined. Non-blocking is defined as incomplete and local, right? This is to match the new definition.
Basically, iProbe is not. It's just that iProbe is not non-blocking because it is not incomplete as in the definition of not blocking. iProbe, I think it's not non-blocking, and without this, it can be misleading that iProbe is non-blocking.
I'm just concerned about the maintenance of this section, because if you add a new function, you have to go back and maintain this section.
No, I think that's not right. There are two changes going on here, two separate changes potentially. The and incomplete is being added because the definition of non-blocking is now the combination of incomplete and local. Local being the synonym of immediate here. So that's what the I means, that it's a non-blocking procedure, and the two semantics that you need for that are immediate, meaning local, and incomplete, meaning incomplete. right? And then separately, the other sentence has been added because iProbe is an exception to that. It has an I on the front, so you could then read that incorrectly as iProbe is non-blocking, but it isn't non-blocking because yes, it's immediate. The I stands for immediate in this case, but it doesn't stand for incomplete because iProbe is not incomplete because it doesn't initiate communication. It doesn't initiate an operation. You can actually argue that it's not operation related because it doesn't do any of the stages of an operation. Right? It just tells you about something. So there's two separate changes here. And I think that then the maintenance side of it, if we updated the definition of non-blocking again, a further time, then yes, sure, we'd have to come back here and update this again, right? We're not going to because that it's already been quite painful doing to this stage. That's an unlikely thing to happen. But if it were to happen, then yes, part of that change would be to go through the document and update everywhere where that made sense to update, right? So the first part would have to change if we were to change non-blocking again, right? But only then.
No, that's not the maintenance I was referring to. I was referring to adding a new function.
So, if we were to add a new function that began with an I, and where the I did not mean incomplete and immediate, and therefore non-blocking, then I would hope that the forum, now that it has seen this, would vote such a thing down. That's not a good thing to be doing, right? If we were to add another exception, then yes, the forum should be insisting that we come back here and add it as an exception. Alternatively, the forum could instruct the author of such a ticket to not begin the function with an I, or to prefix it with an I, which is what's really going on here, right? Because that then necessarily introduces an exception that would have to be covered here.
We already have exceptions apart from iProbe, like MPI put. It's a non-blocking operation, but it doesn't start with an I. So this statement over here that the prefix of I is not a complete list of non-blocking calls anyway. So like earlier, before this, hold on, let me finish, okay? Give me 1 second. This sentence, the way it stood earlier, it just said that I stands for immediate or local, okay? That indicates the call is non-blocking is incorrect, I understand, but the prefix I is immediate is fine. So if you just remove the indicates the call is non-blocking, that would be a more precise change because that's not the definition of a non-blocking call. The I is not the definition of a non-blocking call, like MPI put, for example.
So I think it's an implication here, and implications don't work in reverse. So if it has an I, then that implies that it is non-blocking, but that doesn't, because the implication works that way, you cannot then infer the reverse implication. Non-blocking does not imply that it must have an I on the front, right? And that's what you're saying.
I understand, but if you just remove the indicates the call is non-blocking, that change would make sense.
The sentence is then irrelevant because the parentheses are simply explaining what the we'd have to change the sentence to remove the parentheses, I suppose. In addition, the prefix.
Yeah, right. So in addition, a prefix of I stands for immediate or local. That would be a precise change without adding any more exceptions.
That is true, but in the majority of cases, i.e. everything except iProbe, the I does in fact stand for both, and indeed that's a way of recognizing a non-blocking procedure of that type, right? iSend, ISSend, IRSend, a whole bunch of others, right? There's lots of things that match the sentence as it's currently proposed here. There are very few where the other thing is actually helpful, I think. Maybe they're both true sentences. Your proposal and what's written here are both true. I think that the original intent here was that you can recognize non-blocking procedures by having the I on the front. Because I could equally well object that not all local procedures have an I on the front, and therefore the sentence is meaningless that way as well, right? Com rank is local. It doesn't have an I on the front. It should do because it says the I stands for immediate. So why isn't it com I rank?
So
I
probably
don't
the
think
entire sentence should just be. I think my preference is to delete that entire sentence because instead of trying to fix it, the sentence is just bogus. So just delete it.
I mean, that's an option as well, I suppose. But I think this does actually. The sentence has been there since I think the year dot. But you know, and I think it does actually carry some meaning, as in it conveys to the user that the I prefix, when it is a prefix, generally conveys that the function is going to be non-blocking, the procedure is going to be non-blocking. And I think that is generally true throughout the standard. It isn't the only way of conveying it's non-blocking.
Plenty of functions that's not true for. So I don't know if we should say that.
Which functions is it? Which functions is it not true for?
All of the RMA functions.
No, that's not. So there are none with the I on front.
Correct. That's my point. All of the RMA
that's the reverse. That's the reverse implication, which is not stated here. This is the forward implication that if it has an I on the front, then generally that means it's non-blocking. That does not give you any sort of justification for trying to claim the opposite of that. That if it is not blocking, it has an I on the front.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying that the sentence, that statement over here is not adding any value. It's only adding.
Pavan, do you mean the whole sentence or just the note that sentence?
My proposal is delete the sentence that starts with in addition and don't add anything else.
That bit.
Well, I'm not sure about that because just above we are specifying what B, S, and R are prefixes meant. So it seems strange to don't mention I in this section. And also for the user perspective, I think it's better to say, yeah, I generally implies non-blocking, and iProbe is the one exception of that.
Right. That's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah. The previous sentences seems weird too because we don't follow that convention for blocking synchronous and ready. Like API start. So then it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Just write this a little bit looser and say something like, in addition, in most cases, routines with the prefix of I are immediate and incomplete unless otherwise noted, and then drop the rest.
Why we
have to otherwise note?
You're right. And why do we need that sentence? What's the value that it's adding saying that this is the common case, that's not the common case? Do we have to keep track of how many functions we added which don't meet that rule?
But you know,
the I means something for people generally, right?
Yeah. So Pavan, you know, since MPI1, whenever you see a function which starts with MPI_I, you kind of, you know, assumed it's a non-blocking function, right? That's the nomenclature.
But we have not followed that nomenclature for the last two major standards.
No, we did it with non-blocking collectives.
We did not for RMA.
I think we have followed that convention. We have not followed the reverse implication, which is that all non-blocking things must have an I on the front. That is the opposite. That's direction
I guess
of reasoning.
The convention that Puri is referring to is to have non-blocking operations have an I, which that convention we have not followed in some cases.
No, I think this is not stating that convention. This is stating that a function with I prefix is non-blocking. You said the other way around, that a non-blocking function has an I on the front. That's the opposite direction of implication, and it isn't true.
I understand. I understand, and that's not what I'm saying. Okay, I'm saying that a convention of using I we have only followed in some cases and not all. So my proposal is, let's not say that, let's not say that I means it's non-blocking, even though it's correct in most cases. Let's not say that because it's not adding value.
I think we differ on the fact that it might be adding value. Yeah. I personally think it does add value. I recognise there's a difference of opinion there, but that should therefore be thrown to the wider group. How many people think that this adds value, and how many don't?
The very careful thing that we kind of try to avoid, particularly with RMA, is immediate and non-blocking the same thing, or immediate in the old non-blocking the same thing, which you could argue yes or no, because the RMA chapter never says that any of the functions are immediate, except for the post call, by the way, but everything else is not blocking.
No, in RMA says, it follows local semantics except synchronization. So it's making a blanket statement.
Which the weak it is again weak local, right? Which again is weak local the same as immediate. I think that's a question that's never been answered in the entire standard.
Would
you do this now?
Yeah, that's a good point. That we are sort of synonymizing immediate with local, right? But I don't think that that has ever been stated.
It should be stated, but doing that would certainly cause us. We actually should do this for 4.1 and should define immediate as part of 4.1 or take it out, right?
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to be careful about how, because immediate is not the English definition of it, as in with no time gap. It's a happens before immediate. There is nothing which prevents it from returning. There's no arbitrary delay controlled by something else. It's quite a complex immediate.
So one other thing for here then, though, I mean, at the end, you guys are saying this adds value because it gives the user an idea if the user an iRoutine is what it's meant, right? Mm-hmm. So this sounds to me like not normative text. It sounds like advice to users. If you change that text that we had before as to an advice of users, make it non-binding, not normative, then add some of what's usual, then I think, would that address some of the concerns that you have while still
yes, the text? Yes, absolutely. That's a good solution. Including the BS crap, because that's incorrect too.
Well, this another correction might be this is only in the point-to-point communication, so we just can start the paragraph with in the context of point-to-point communications. We use these prefix.
You use the I also for the collectives now, right?
Yeah. But it also solves the problem of the S, right? Or at least just say for point-to-point in collective communication we use, well, I'm just thinking for the B, S, and R, and the problem with the S set.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Is MPI,
let's do both.
MPI start, which chapter does MPI start come in?
Point 3 only. Yeah, same chapter.
But it's used in.
So it's not synchronous. So. Anyway, so putting it as as a advice to users, I think is a good solution, right? You can still have that wording, but it's not normative, so it won't bother seriously.
Yeah, we could do both. I think we could do both. We could make it an advice to users and start it with in the context of point-to-point. And then it is both restricted in scope and removed from the normative text.
So does that address your concern, Pavan?
Partially, but I wouldn't, vote no for as long as it's not normative. I vote no for that.
So, and we are only talking about this part, right? And we're not touching the buffer, synchronous, ready, that part.
No.
You want
that
the whole thing?
Paragraph.
Oh, okay.
Because that's wrong, right? Like if you start, it's incorrect, right?
So, Pawan, just to give you an idea, see how our scope seems to expand every time we have this discussion, because this is not what we were planning to touch anyway. Now we are touching, the whole buffered synchronous and ready part. So, I mean, I'm not saying that, your comments are well received. It's just that how things have evolved. This is just an example of that.
Welcome to the forum.
I think that we need to be careful about the word prefix here as well, because what we mean by prefix here, implicitly, it's never stated, is that there is a function without the prefix in existence. And so start is a bad example because there isn't one without the S on it. And if somebody were to define such a function, I have no idea what it would do, but then the S might look like a prefix. At the moment, it doesn't look like a prefix, although technically, by the English definition of prefix, it does start with an S and therefore is prefixed by. But I think what we mean
really
something.
Weeds, right?
Exactly. So I think, this is another example of how the scope has expanded. Is how deep do we go? How many do we define the word prefix here? What we actually mean is there is a function called X, and if you prefix that with a letter, then you get IX or SX or BX or something. The existence of the other thing is necessary in order for it to be a prefix, right? We've got several extra sentences just to define what we mean by prefix here, and I don't think that adds any value.
I think we have Tony on the line, right? He would probably object now because he's going to want to start introducing stuff without the non-I calls.
Yeah, just a non-blocking version of something, and then we will probably want to follow the convention, or at least within point-to-point and within collectives, we probably want to follow the convention of having an I as the first letter of something, I and then the verb.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, RMA has not followed that convention. It didn't need to and nobody seems to have objected very much. It could have done, but then it's actually made its own convention. The R in R put doesn't mean ready mode put. So it follows a different convention. This is.
I haven't thought about this here, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I agree with Pavan that lines 45 onwards need to be looked at again, especially in the context of RMA, because trying to extend that statement to RMA, the B and the S possibly don't make any sense in the context of RMA, but the R causes problems. So yeah,
I think, again, if you look at the context where this is appearing under the non-blocking section. So 3.7 is the non-blocking communication. So the blocking is already defined, and I'm making an assumption here that the intent of this section was to say that, hey, we had all these blocking communication. We are going to follow the same naming convention, except that we are going to add this letter I for the non-blocking call. So that's looks like the intent of this particular section.
Yeah, but I think it's dangerous because at the moment, the RMA section does use the word non-blocking, which means that you get referred back to here implicitly, because this is where non-blocking is defined in the first instance. How do you initiate communication? You come to 372 from RMA, trying to figure out what this non-blocking term means. And then it says that where you see an R as a prefix, you mean ready mode. So now my R put looks like a ready mode put. No, you read the standard as a whole, or we put a sentence in here that scopes it and says within the context of point to point.
Yeah, I think we should just
first sentence.
I would be in favor of that.
Yeah, and maybe in 4.1 in the non-blocking collective part say that we use the same prefix I for non-blocking to specify that the collective are non-blocking. And so also say that in the scope of collective, we use the prefix I for non-blocking, and that's it.
Right. If you wanted to make it cross standard, you would have to pull it up or pull it into Appendix A and make it really consistent across everything, right? And they describe all the exceptions, which sounds like a good approach for 4.1.
At the point right now, I think that the thing to do would be to make at least the sentence 45, 46 here. We should scope that to within point to point and potentially make it a advice to users. I don't really mind about that. That's fine as well. Both apply to that. And then the second sentence, in addition, the I bit, we could make that non-normative by making it advice to users. Generally, we follow this pattern, but we could also scope it by saying within the context of point-to-point and collectives. Right? Do we also do it in the IO chapter? Is that there are I courses, I write and I read. It means the same thing there. So we probably mean everywhere except the RMA chapter for that second sentence. So we could scope that with the sentence that said everywhere except the RMA chapter. We generally mean this for the second sentence.
I think if you make it non-normative, because this is actually really just informing the user about naming convention, I think then a change like this shouldn't be a problem. Yeah. Then if you want to decide in 4.1, we want to pull it out and make it consistent and put it in a top section, we can do that, right?
So the next procedural question is, should that be done by the chapter committee, i.e. me, just as a change that clarifies the document? It's completely irrelevant. It's not within the semantic terms remit to do that. I could simply make those sentences non-normative by putting an advice to users around them and be done with it. And then when this semantic terms thing comes along, it will see this advice really ought to change because there's now an exception, right? It would do exactly this change, but rather than changing normative text, it would be changing an advice to users.
Personally, would just say added to the ticket. I think we all agree this fits, and I don't think this will cause the ticket to fail. And then it's clean cut, because now if you suddenly come up with something you've changed under the hood, I think that will look worse than just adding it here plain.
Okay.
Anybody object to that? I mean, is anybody doing the wrong thing by putting this into advice to users? Anybody vote no on this ticket, and if that would be the case for this reason? I mean, I think let's do that and do the reading with the advice. And if people really object, then we make a no to put it back to what it was. But if you read this text, the text is not normative just by the English language in here, right? It just tells about a naming convention. It is an advice to users as is. So if you just mark it at that, I think there's no harm in that.
You mark it as advice, but don't do the scoping sentences.
I'm personally ambivalent about the scoping sentences, but if people feel that's important, I'm not going to object.
It looks to me that, it is true.
I think, yeah.
Things like MPI start, right? Those are, I'm a little concerned about those too. Not just RMA.
So, coming.
But I think you are considering wording like it is generally used this way or something like that. Right. I mean, as long as it's not normative, saying using vague sentences like it's generally this way might be fine. I don't know. For normative text, of course, it shouldn't be vague. But if it's non-normative, vague sentences are fine. So all this is under the caveat that it will become non-normative.
For this to be normative and applied across the whole standard, we kind of need to make other changes, right? And we should look at this for 4.1. We should put it on the list.
I'm not sure what the instruction is here for what we should do as a semantic working group then for this. I think that there's a general opinion that we should make this non-normative, but then there is debate about whether we should then change the content of it as well. And if so, in what direction and what to exactly do with it. I think a clear instruction given the time constraints would be useful, because we haven't got the time to go around.
Considering the time, I think it would be better just to put it as non-normative and don't change further the text.
Is that acceptable, Pavan?
Non-normative plus weaken the sentence to say it is generally the case or something like that. But yeah.
So That's what I would suggest too. Normal, and then add the word generally before the first sentence and before the in addition.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Okay. And I will show the other changes continuing along. Okay. So this is a clarification of the request. Again, the line is showing for the whole thing, but unfortunately it's not, we didn't change the whole thing. We just clarified that now that we have collective and persistent operations, that this request, applies to that as well. Classes of operation described later in the standard, such as non-blocking collectives and persistent collectives, also use request objects. In case of non-blocking operations or active persistent requests, this routine. So this part already exists. So we didn't quite change all of that. The use of this routine for generalized requests, okay, that we didn't change either. Here, this is the part. In the case of non-blocking collective operations and in the case of persistent collective operations with an active request handle, it is erroneous to call MPI request free. So that's that part, and the sentence here is what we have really added. Just clarifying the use of the MPI request free operation in the other chapters. Okay. And whatever the exception we noted there, we're noting it here as well. MPI probe is a local procedure since it does not depend on any depend on MPI calls in other MPI processes, which is marked with the prefix I for immediate. So again, noting that iProbe is a local procedure or an immediate procedure, not a procedure.
Should we strike the, which is marked with a prefix bit,
off?
If we're going to make it just that, sometimes we do this and sometimes we don't. Do we want to call it out here that we have, or do we?
So I think it is important to, at least to me, because there is an I in front of this, to make the distinction.
Yeah, I would leave it too.
Yeah, I would leave it, but I'm asking the question so that Pavan can object if he wishes to, given he doesn't like the previous thing that was where the I isn't applied in other places.
Objection from Pavan. Okay.
No objections.
All right. Okay. MPI probe behaves like iProbe, except that it is a non-local call that returns only after a matching message has been found. So this is an addition, and I'm not sure what the change here is referring to. We had a space there. Okay, so this change, I'm not exactly sure what was it something deleted or something added here? I can't tell from the PDF file.
I seem to remember that it actually said iProbe, didn't it?
No,
was it wrong?
I just checked. It said use blocking probe.
Ah.
And the blocking was removed.
Okay. Because of the new definition. Okay. All right. Okay.
No, that's an example, not normative anyway.
Right. And this is just to make sure of this exception that we added to get rid of that blocking there. Okay. Then again, IMProbe, I think I showed this earlier. It's a local procedure, and we talked about this. Initialization. And same thing. IMProbe. According to the definitions of section 4.2, mprobe is incomplete. It is also a non-local procedure. And this is advice to user. This is one of the exceptions in which incomplete procedures are non-local. So that's another example of the exception.
This is mprobe, not IM. No, go back.
This is
It says mprobe is incomplete.
yes.
Not IMprobe.
No, this is mprobe. Sorry. The previous one.
Mprobe is incomplete.
Yes.
So are you querying whether mprobe is incomplete as in the correctness of the sentence, or are you querying whether Puri said it correctly?
The sentence that shows on the screen right now, it says mprobe is incomplete.
Which is true.
Yes. Okay, sorry. Never mind.
I may have said it as IMprobe when I read it, so I apologize when I did that. But this is mprobe, and in the previous case, it was the IMprobe. Okay. And then I advise to users for the mreceive. Although the completion of mreceive does not depend on any specific procedure call in the corresponding sending MPI process, mreceive is not defined to be a local operation because its completion may still depend on progress on the corresponding sending MPI process, example provided by calls to test wait and blocking operation related procedures or MPI files. So again, an advice to user. Okay. And then this is related to, this is in the collectives communication chapter. This is after the description of, so let me just give you the context of in the persistent collective operations. So we talk about the initialization and the freeing with the request free. And we have this paragraph here to say, according to the definitions in section 2.4.2, the persistent collective initialization procedures are incomplete. They are also non-local procedures because they may or may not return before they are called in all MPI processes of the process group associated with the specified communicator. Advice to user, this is one of the exceptions in which incomplete procedures are non-local and therefore blocking. Okay. Next. Cool. Okay, this is in the infos key chapter. Okay. And initially it read it as non-blocking routines. Now we have added the persistent collectives, so we changed it to say to any MPI routine. It used to be a non-blocking routine. Now we are replacing that with MPI routine because now it applies to persistent collectives also, not only non-blocking. And this is the split collectives, I believe. So again, according to the definition, the begin procedures are incomplete. They're also non-local procedures because they may or may not return before they are called in all MPI processes of the process group. This is one of the exceptions in which incomplete procedures are non-local and therefore blocking. Okay. And that's it, and then the rest is the table.
Puri, is this annotated version uploaded somewhere or only the final version uploaded?
I uploaded only the final version. Rolf had uploaded the annotated version, but I can upload the annotated version also.
That would,
yeah.
Because if you can, or would someone mind doing that while you're presenting so it's easier to follow along?
Dan,
Someone else.
yeah, Dan, do you have access to the?
We only have 9 minutes to go. I don't know that it's worth putting a ton of effort into this.
All right. So, but that was the last change, and as soon as I'm done, I will definitely put it up on the pull request too. So that way it's there.
Yeah, we should definitely have this for the proper formal reading in June, later in June. But right now, I think we've just gone through all the changes. So,
can you go up to the change in the info object real quick, please?
Sure.
So the detail, but the one thing I'm pondering with the any routine, I mean, this also then covers all the info routines themselves, right?
Yeah.
So after free, you shouldn't use read, modify, or free it. It's a little stupid detail, but with any routine, you open it up wide, right?
Right, but again, the reason for making this change is that it said only for non-blocking routines, because info was ordered only for non-blocking routines.
Yeah, no, I'm not objecting to that, and I think it's true, except for a few routines in the MPI info chapter, which also have in-out parameters for info objects, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the free, maybe the only one that actually is affected, because anything else, you get an info object back, it has been modified to the point where you want it modified to, so you can then read and modify it further or free it. So I think it should read to any MPI routine except MPI info free.
Oh, okay. Well, I see what you're saying. Okay.
It's a stupid detail, but it's technically necessary.
So isn't the info object on the way out of info free? Isn't it info null? In which case there isn't an info object anymore. In which case, yeah, you go ahead and read and modify any info object that does come out of this routine, but there isn't going to be one.
Good question.
Same as request free and things. I think you get back something that's you can't work with it. It's not an info object. All of the info objects that come out are readable, modifiable, and freeable. But it's a vacuous statement because there are no info objects that come out.
Yeah. And this is such a minute detail. Since I'm the info chapter chair, I'll take a look at this until next Tuesday and make sure we don't we need to something or not. I don't think this should hold up things. I want to rather leave the last 5 minutes for other folks. I'll take an action item to look at that.
Okay. Thank you, Martin. All right, so that's all the changes from my side, and we at least had one item to go back and look at, which is the this particular one. Okay. All right, so we will try to get that fixed. All right, any other concerns, comments, please, do let me know, or post a comment on the pull request. Okay. I will hand over the control back.
So are there any more questions or comments on this? Any concerns? I said, please let Puri know ahead of time so the working group can make the changes if needed. Procedurally, this could be done in two ways. Either we take all the changes the working group has done and do it as a no-no vote in June, or we just do a full reading. I think the working group has already come to the conclusion this is a lot. So the suggestion would be to do as a full reading. But then in order not to disturb the timeline, we still would like to see at least the final release candidate of the standard to be ready for supercomputing, the idea was to potentially add another virtual meeting in between. This can only be done at virtual meetings, so we would bring this up in the June meeting as a heads up. This is kind of the current plan that we're planning on suggesting. If there are any negative reactions to that, it would also be good to know sooner than later. The idea would to have another meeting somewhere between June and November, whether it's before or after the September meeting, we can decide. We get together for 1 or 2 days, perhaps 3 days, virtually again, and do the necessary things that are still there to vote in what we need to do to get a final release candidate for supercomputing. Anybody have any comments on this? I think that's a bad idea, or have any objections against that procedure? We had this option already on the table in even Albuquerque, but then we were all reluctant because back then we still thought we traveled to meetings. So this got, in this sense, a little bit easier now. So that's why we were suggesting to go this way. So do it cleanly and still have the ability to get a supercomputing MPI 4.0, at least as a release candidate out the door.
So as part of that, when we have the meeting in a few weeks, bring any scheduling conflicts along with you, because at some point, if we do want to do this, we'll need to actually find a time that'll work.
Yes, good point. Thanks, Wesley. That's a really good point. Okay, I think that covers it then. Any other comments or questions people have, or things we need to talk in the last 120 seconds?
Thanks to Pavan and everybody who gave feedback. This is very helpful. This is exactly what we wanted to achieve through this virtual call.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for joining, particularly in this in the larger numbers today. It was really helpful. Yeah, Pavan?
As just about said, the proposal is really good at this point. I like the changes. It's very clean, except for a few nitpicks here and there. Earlier, I was almost convinced that I would vote no for it, but now I think I'm almost convinced that I will vote yes for it.
Okay, thank you. And if you have other suggestions or nitpicks like that, please let us know.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And I think we're done for today. We'll meet again next week where we're going to talk about topology routines. It's kind of a pre-reading from Rolf on his suggested new topology routines. And then this is also next week is the last Wednesday before the 2-week deadline. So if there is something that you want to bring up that relates to the deadline, please do that next week too. Send email to Wesley and me so we can get on our radar. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening, day, wherever you are, and talk to you next week.
Bye.
Okay, thank you, Paris.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.